Hello everyone and welcome to round 7 of the Tata chess tournament in Wijk aan Zee, the Netherlands. In this video we'll have a look at the game between Jordan van Foreest and Vidit. Now before this round Vidit was still in the lead with 4 points out of 6 games and Jordan just came off 2 losses. He was on 2.5 out of 6, so I'm sure that Jordan was looking to bounce back and he opened up the game with the move 1d4. A bit of a surprise, Jordan generally plays the move 1e4. So I guess he wanted to surprise Vidit here a little bit. Vidit played knight f6, c4 and e6. And after knight c3 we have the Nimzo Indian defense. Alright, so Jordan goes queen c2, one of the main lines. And after short castles he played the move a3. We see trade on c3 and d5. And this line was really introduced by Vladimir Kramnik in the early 2010s. Jordan goes knight f3. Now I also had some games here with the move bishop g5. Jordan had this recently at the World Rapid Championship against Hikaru Nakamura, in which Hikaru played the move e3. But knight f3 is the traditional main line. We see trade on c4 and then b6, bishop g5. And Kramnik had a bunch of games here with the move bishop a6. Now queen a4 is usually the main line. Queen d7 was usually played by Kramnik. And there's a lot of things white can try, for example, queen c2, and black tries to open up the center very quickly. The main line goes something like this: trade, rook d1 and queen b5 with massive complications. I mean, black has sacrificed a pawn. His king is a little bit weakened, but look at white. The king is still stuck in the center. This bishop still has to develop. I mean, you still have to make a move like g3 or e3. Move the bishop out and get castled. So that is how usually the main line goes, but Vidit chose another move. He chose the move bishop b7, which is also one of the main moves these days. And Jordan played knight e5, queen d6 by Vidit, e3 and c5, trying to open up the center. Now note that on several occasions white can take here, but it's not clear who that favors. I mean, white does give up the bishop for the knight and opens up the king. But, I mean, at the same time, now he has to move this knight and he is going to lose time there. So instead of that, Jordan goes bishop f4, preparing an x-ray on the queen. Now you cannot take on d4 due to knight g6, and black is losing the exchange. So instead of that, Vidit steps out of the way with queen e7. We see trade on c5 by Jordan and rook c8. Vidit wants to take with the rook and keep an active position. So Jordan goes bishop e2 to develop, rook takes c5, queen d4. And in the interview, Jordan mentioned that he thought rook d5 was just a repetition. Queen b4 is the main move, and then rook c5. And apparently white has nothing better here than to repeat, because if you go castles, black has the move knight d5, hitting the queen and the bishop. So there would have actually been a way for Vidit to equalize very comfortably, but he played the move knight d5. Alright, so the move knight d5 is hitting the bishop. Jordan steps out of the way, and now we have an interesting position. So we see that Jordan has the 2 bishops, but he still needs to get castled, so interesting to see how this will play out. Vidit played the move f6, and here Jordan made a bit of an inaccuracy. He should have played the move knight d3, hitting the rook, and the point really being that in a position like this, the queen can always slide over to the a4 square, where it's sitting pretty comfortably. It's putting some pressure potentially on the black queen side, and white should have quite a comfortable advantage due to the 2 bishops. Anyway, Jordan played the move knight to c4, and here Vidit could have played knight to c6, and here we see the difference. I mean, if white goes queen h4, I mean, yes, the queen is fine there, but it's always a little bit off, and you can't really drop back on the d file, because then after rook d8, you have a lot of problems on both the d and the c files. The queen is really lacking a good place. But instead of that, Vidit played bishop a6, hitting knight, and now Jordan solves this problem by going b3, defending the knight, and after knight c6, queen b2. Here the queen is a little bit sheltered from all the attacks from the black pieces. Note that white is trying to move bishop to d6, so Vidit goes e5, shutting that bishop down, and especially the threat of bishop d6. So Jordan goes rook to d1 and knight e5 by Vidit. A nice move, hitting the knight, and it's not easy for white to solve this. I mean, you can take on a5 because black is going to take on e2, and if you recapture, then black has this fork on the queen and the rook. So white cannot go into this. So instead of that, Jordan just castled, but now Vidit trades on c4, and Jordan is forced to take with the pawn, and now his pawn structure is weakened. He's got 2 isolated pawns. Note that Vidit cannot take the pawn on c4, because if you take, white's going to trade, and then take on d5, and he wins a pawn. So instead of that, Vidit played knight to c7. I mean, the knight had to go somewhere. And Jordan goes queen b3, defending the pawn on c4. And here's where Vidit is probably a little bit better, because he has a better pawn structure. But here's where he made quite a serious mistake. In this position, white has the two bishops to compensate for the weaker pawn structure. But this bishop on g3 is not really doing much. It's kind of stuck staring at this pawn on e5, and this bishop is just defending its own pawn. So what should Vidit have done? Vidit should have played the move knight e6. And the main idea behind this move is that it's stopping the move f4. But if white goes f4 now to try to open up this bishop, black can take. And after pawn takes, black has the tactics, knight takes f4. And if you take, the bishop on e2 hangs, and black suddenly wins a pawn. So knight e6 would have been a very nice move for Vidit. Also, it prepares the move rook ac8 to put a lot of pressure on this pawn on c4. But instead, Vidit played queen e6, hitting the pawn on c4 right away. But now Jordan goes f4, and things get a bit out of control. Now here Vidit should have taken on c4, but after massive trades, white's going to take on e5, and after takes rook e8, it's probably headed for a draw. I mean, white has the active bishop, but his pawns are still a bit weak, and black shouldn't really have anything to worry about. But instead of that, Vidit played pawn takes f4, and now Jordan takes with the rook. And we have an interesting position. We see that the white's pawn structure is really ugly. I mean, he's got 3 isolated pawns. And all of black's pawns are nicely connected. But now suddenly this bishop opens up, and the black pieces have trouble coordinating. Vidit goes rook e8, and Jordan plays bishop f2, which is a little bit passive. Instead of that, he should have played the more active rook fd4. I mean, he's sacrificing the pawn on e3, but after black takes, he now has a lot of activity. For example, rook d8 check, and things are not easy for black. If you go rook e8, white is going to remove the defender on c7, and in this case he wins material, so black cannot do that. If black plays knight e8, which is a more resilient move, white has a very strong bishop f3, and is now ready to play someone like bishop d5. Bishop f2 is always a threat, so here white has more than enough compensation for the pawn. And if black goes king f7, during the broadcast, Hikaru and I thought that probably the easiest way to continue here for white was someone like rook d7, and if king g6, bishop f2, and if takes, you take the rook, and the knight is always hanging in the end. I mean, all pretty complicated, but that would have been the better move for Jordan, because in the game, I mean, bishop f2 is a little bit passive. Now in this position, Vidit played queen f7, and after rook fd4, he played bishop c8, which is also a bit passive. He should have played the move knight e6 to hit the rook, and then after rook d7, rook e7. I mean, we get the players trade off one pair of rooks, but black should be still doing pretty well here. I mean, the white pawns are quite weak, black's pieces are nicely coordinated, so black should be pretty comfortable here. Instead, he played the move bishop to c8, and now Jordan played bishop g3, bringing this bishop back into the game, knight e6 and rook to d5. Alright, and here it was a bit surprising to see that Vidit, he traded on d5, because now white gets a very strong passed c-pawn, but he goes knight c5, hitting the queen and the pawn on e3, so Jordan goes queen c3 to defend everything. Now Vidit played knight e4, and Jordan goes queen d4, and here things started getting out of control for Vidit. I mean, things are not easy. I mean, this passed d-pawn is pretty strong. You can take the bishop on g3, but that's not really going to solve your problems anyway, because white can go d6, and rook c1, rook c7 gets very active. The king on f2 can always guard all the weaknesses, so white definitely has a nice advantage here. So instead of that, Vidit played bishop d7, but now Jordan goes bishop f4, keeping his bishop on the board. If Vidit goes g5, hitting the bishop, which does not have a comfortable square, but know that in the process, he's weakening his king side. So Jordan goes bishop c7, keeping that bishop on the board, king g7 by Vidit, and Jordan goes rook f1, putting pressure on the weak pawn on f6. Now here the position started getting pretty tricky for Vidit. Also, he was getting low on the clock, and it's just very difficult for black to make a move here. I mean, what do? I mean, this bishop, I mean, you can't really move the rook, you always get hit by d6, and it just feels like the pieces are sort of already on their ideal square. So very difficult for black here to improve the position. The computer suggests the move h6 to just strengthen everything, but very difficult to make such a move during the game and be like, okay, my opponent now has a free move and he can really use it in a good way. But Vidit played the move queen e7, and now Jordan played bishop h5, hitting the rook on e8, so he's really trying to dislodge the defenses of the knight on e4. And here Vidit made the decisive mistake. In this position he played rook to c8, but instead of that he should have played rook f8, to make sure that this pawn is always guarded. Now if Jordan plays d6, black can play queen e5 for example, and now after the trade this f7 square is protected. And even though white should still be better here due to the two bishops, black should be able to draw this. But in the game, Vidit chose the move rook c8. And now came d6 by Jordan. And Vidit is only in trouble. This queen is under attack, and where do you go? You cannot go to e5 because Jordan's going to trade, and after takes rook f7 check, hit the bishop, hit the king, and white is winning. So Vidit had to play queen e6. But now came bishop f3, and your knight is under attack. And where do you go with the knight? The only square you can go to is c5. You cannot defend the knight. I mean, the f pawn is pinned to your king, and you cannot play a move like bishop c6 because white is simply going to take, and if you recapture, you lost control of the d pawn. So here, white is simply winning a rook. So Vidit can also not do that. Instead, he played knight to c5, but now came bishop d5, hitting the queen. And the queen has to keep defending this pawn on f6, so Vidit's only move was queen e5. But now Jordan traded queens, and he went rook f7, infiltrating the position with the rook. Vidit was forced to go to g6, but now Jordan found a very pretty finish of the game. He played rook takes d7, sacrificing the exchange, and after knight takes d7, bishop e6, and black is just lost. This knight is under attack, and if the knight moves, he's gonna lose the rook. You cannot play rook d8, that square is covered by the bishop, and this doesn't help matters anyway. White is simply going to get a new queen. So very, very tough loss for Vidit, who now drops a bit in the standings. He's no longer in the lead, but a very nice win for Jordan, who gets back to 50%. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.